Let's start by acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Australia's past is a foreign country. Once we were proud to be Australian. We could wave the flag without shame, and Australia Day was a celebration of unity. But those days are long gone. Our nation, once known for its laid-back attitude and larrikin spirit, has transformed into a nanny state where freedom is on a short leash. We've gone from "she'll be right, mate" to "please, sir, may I have another." The encroachment on our society and culture was insidious at first. Politicians enacted lockout laws for our health and safety and other nonsense. As a trusting society, we initially believed them. I never really gave a shit about politics until 2016, when my favourite bar got shut down by these lockout laws, and then my go-to restaurant closed too. The media was having a collective aneurysm about alcohol-fueled violence, screaming enough is enough on a warpath to close every bar and club in sight. But hang on a second. This whole circus was over 2 deaths, both outside venues. One maniac sculled a case of vodka and went on a punching spree. He wasn't let into venues, was caught and issued a move-on order by police. He tragically ended up hitting someone who fell over and hit their head outside the venue at 9:30 p.m. The other was an attempted drug deal gone wrong with a bodybuilder's girlfriend on New Year's Eve. If you remember, the government's going crazy gaslighting the public that violence had spiralled out of control. I thought, hang on, hadn't George Soros, the tourism minister, proclaimed that Sydney has just won the safest and friendliest city in the world award? Both tragedies, sure, but how does that justify shutting down this entire city's nightlife? The truth soon emerged. It was never about our welfare, but rather a desire for casino patronage and to clear the way for property development. All to demolish for apartments, but apartments for who exactly? Hold on to that thought, we'll come back to that later. Now drama dogs are every step. Australia Day sparks outrage, global events become local crises. We've become a nation on edge where calm is the exception and conflict is the new normal. Our spirit of rebellion and irreverence, the very essence of what it means to be Australian, has been crushed by a deluge of stupid laws, rules and regulations. No Australian actually wants any of this crap, yet the government keeps ramming it down our throats. Even the Americans, of all people, laugh at us. We used to say, thank God we got the Puritans and they got the Puritans and we got the convicts. Now they tell us your country simply needs to be invaded and reverted back to a prison colony. It's a masterclass in how quickly you can lose your freedoms when you stop giving a damn. We forgot the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Once upon a time, it would have been unthinkable for Australia to rank among the world's worst for government censorship of social media. Yet here we are, with the worst track record for any government in the world for the censorship of TikTok. Australia's media ranks 39th in the Press Freedom Index, behind South Africa, Namibia and the Dominican Republic, due to an hyper-concentration of the media combined with growing pressure from authorities. It's not going to get any better with the government directly funding legacy media like Channel 10's $33 million to keep the lights on and the story straight. Once upon a time, Australia was a country not only renowned, but defined through our sense of mateship. Tourism Australia used to proclaim it as the beating heart of the Australian spirit. Mateship was an Australian military virtue. Yet today, despite record population growth, where Australia adds a Canberra and a Darwin combined every year, our military faces crippling shortages. Nobody wants to fight for the army. Defence Force Chief Angus Campbell told Parliament recently that hiring rates are below the level required to maintain the Australian Defence Force, 7% below the target of 60,000, and the government wants to raise it to 80,000. In an attempt to address the military's recruitment crisis, the government has resorted to the ludicrous and dangerous prospect of lowering standards on mental health for new recruits, while simultaneously importing soldiers to fight for the nation from places like Tuvalu. Do you think that's really going to help with recruiting? If the erosion of our freedoms and sense of self wasn't enough, Australians are grappling with the highest tax hike in the developed world. Taxes are up 7.6% in the last year alone, while we're also facing the biggest decline in living standards in the OECD, with gross household disposable incomes falling 6.1% in the worst per capita recession since the Great Depression. Once upon a time, we believed in the great Australian dream, where home ownership could lead to a better life and was an expression of success and security. That dream is now impossible for the average person, not because of one's lack of talent, skill or ability, but because of simple mathematics. In Sydney now, it takes, well, it took last month 46 years to save for an average house deposit. Not the house, the deposit. Actually, with the latest numbers that came out, it's probably over 50. So if you start saving at 20, you'll have enough money for a deposit by the age of 70. But of course, by then, the house will have a zero on its price tag. The Great Australian Dream has become a Great Australian Scream. No longer do Australians have a fair go. Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, famously said of his country's founding, "Soon after separation, I resolved to enable every household to own its own home. If we were going to get people to take national service seriously, I could not ask their sons to fight for the properties of the wealthy." It's no surprise that people don't want to fight for this country anymore. Australia has gone from embodying the selfless Anzac spirit, where sacrifice for the greater good and future generations was a sacred duty, to a nation that seems all too willing to sacrifice everybody's future. The dream of home ownership, once a cornerstone of Australian identity and aspiration, has gone. Blind Freddie can tell you this is not sustainable. No, this is not a country, not by any means a functional country. Australian politicians have wrecked this great nation. They have created the mother of all property bubbles on a scale like no other, that is now desperately being propped up by the mother of all immigration programs, causing a cost of living crisis, a deterioration in Australian wealth, and a deterioration of our high trust society, a deterioration of our culture, and a deterioration of our way of life at a pace that is unlike anything the country has seen before. People are being forced to live in tent cities, which are mushrooming all over Australia, as rental vacancies collapse to historic lows. We're being lied to and gaslit about the reasons for the astronomical cost of our housing. Our immigration minister and economists tell us the problem is we need more migrants to build more homes for more migrants. Next, they'll tell us to import more comedians to laugh at their jokes. Master Builders Australia, the home builder lobbyist group, says we have a skills crisis and it needs to be easier to get a visa. Our former Reserve Bank governor says no. Where is he? The problem is you. The price of land is high because of the choices we make as a society of where to live, how to tax housing, and how to invest in transport. And this is the guy, Bubble O'Phil, who encouraged everyone to mortgage to the hilt by saying in 2021 that rates would stay at 0.1% until 2024 at the earliest. No, the actual reason for the housing catastrophe is straightforward. It's basic supply and demand, but probably not what you've been led to believe. For supply, we build a ridiculous amount of homes. Australia has the second highest rate of home building from a major country in the developed world, not just in terms of newly constructed homes and housing stock, but also in terms of per capita rates for the last decade. We have been going mental at building homes since at least the Sydney Olympics and driving a massive housing bubble for the last 64 or 5 years. So high is home building in this country that more than half of newly registered apartments in New South Wales since 2016 have defects. And the New South Wales Building Commissioner has had to increase his staff from 24 to 400. So insane is the home building in this country that according to the Ryder Levitt Bucknell Quarterly Crane Index, which tracks the number of active cranes in the world, in the first quarter of this year, Australia has 869 cranes on construction sites nationwide, the second highest on record after the quarter before. Sydney alone has 390, and the vast majority of them are for residential apartments. To put this in perspective, New York has 5. Chicago has 3. In fact, Sydney has more cranes than New York, Boston, Toronto, Washington, Chicago, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, Portland, Honolulu, San Francisco, Seattle, and Calgary combined. Now, remember at the beginning of this speech where I talked about how the lockout laws, and back in 2016, they were bulldozing every bar or venue they could find for property developers, and with it a large part of Australian music culture. There wasn't a social or cultural institution the politicians were not prepared to knock down for apartments. Nightlife precincts, theatres, churches, cinemas, the local racetrack, Sydney Entertainment Centre, Festival Hall, the Powerhouse Museum. With each one demolished, another small part of Australian culture was lost. And for what? to build apartments for who exactly? What do you think the true level of net additional housing demand is from Australians? How many more dwellings do Australians actually need? I'll tell you the answer, and you might be a little bit shocked. None. Zero. Zilch. That's because every Australian woman needs to have 2.1 children just to maintain the population. We haven't been above 2.1 since 1976. That's the replacement rate. Australia's fertility rate is 1.63 and dropping like a rock. Well, people will say, what about population momentum? Fertility rate has been below the replacement rate for 50 years. 50. Yes, since the 1970s, we've been living longer by about 10 years. That's about 14% longer lifespans. But the fertility rate has collapsed 22%. Any momentum that Australia had from the pre-1970s higher fertility period has largely played out. It usually does that over a generation. It's now been 2 generations. And I'll tell you one thing, the cost of living crisis certainly isn't improving fertility levels. Let's face it, the population growth that we see in the stats of births over deaths is likely coming from new migrants or recent citizens starting families. Government and mainstream media, the owners of all the property classifieds, can gaslight you all day long, but it's as plain as day what has caused the cost of living crisis. Politicians have pursued the path of easy, relentless growth for decades, blowing a property bubble on a scale like no other, the mother of all bubbles that since 1956 has seen house prices go up 110 times. There is no latent demand that is in Australia for additional housing. None. No, the astronomical demand is entirely coming from a totally out of control, uncalibrated, untargeted and unhinged immigration program. This is why your local venue, church, racetrack or pub has been knocked down, not because we have a baby boom, but because we have a reckless immigration program. They did it to Harold Park, they're going to do it to Rosehill Racecourse, they're expropriating half a golf course at Moore Park in Sydney because they allowed developers to build apartment ghetto in Waterloo without any parks. There's nothing they won't knock down or steal to keep jamming people in. I'm sick of being lied to about the reasons we're losing the social and cultural fabric of Australian society, aren't you? Unsurprisingly, when you have an insane immigration policy and 2.4 million people in the country have 26 million on temporary visas, you have an extreme housing response. And if you line up the graphs of population growth next to the growth in rents, they perfectly line up. Surprise, surprise, supply and demand. They'll try and gaslight you about changing household size, but the average number of people per household hasn't budged in 25 years prior to COVID. If anything, the cost of living crisis is forcing many to take on a flatmate to increase housing sizes. They're also trying to pass off the immigration levels as just playing catch up after we closed the borders for COVID. But even before the pandemic, our immigration intake was off the charts, fueling a cost of living crisis that was already spiralling out of control. Australia's housing market was already at nosebleed levels in terms of affordability at the GFC. Indeed, it was a house of cards. COVID didn't create this mess. It just paused a runaway train that's now back on tracks and picking up speed. Insane immigration has caused insane rises in the cost of housing. Insane rises in the cost of housing has caused insane rises in the cost of everything. Now Australia is the only G10 country where inflation is increasing. So now the government is trying to give you temporary rebates off your electricity bill, transport and so on. They're not giving cash directly, they're reducing the bill so they can fudge the inflation numbers. To genuinely curb inflation, however, interest rates need to be higher than the inflation rate. Otherwise, why would anyone bother saving when their money is worth less day by day? There's a nifty tool economists use called the Taylor rule, to figure out where rates should be. With the official consumer price index of 3.8%, a number that anyone will realise is complete horseshit, looking at the rent or price of a beer or steak at the pub, and the Taylor rule says interest rates should be close to 7 or 8%. The RBA doesn't want to raise rates because they know it will bring down the housing market. So instead, they're prepared to turn the Australian dollar into confetti. The fundamental issue is fertility, and that isn't going to improve on the path we are on. The cost of living crisis isn't getting any better, it's getting worse, and jamming people into shoeboxes that take multiple lifetimes to pay off is going to decimate natural births in this country. In the December quarter of 2023, Australian births were down 6.4% year on year, despite a 2.5% increase in population. Government policies are destroying the ability for young Australians to not just own a home, but also destroying their ability to have kids. It's obvious to say it, but research demonstrates that couples in single-family homes show significantly higher fertility rates than those in apartments, even years after moving. Surprise, surprise. Spacious, family-friendly housing environments encourage childbearing. So if we have policies that promote affordable access to larger family-orientated housing, we will likely get higher fertility levels. Conversely, economic pressures that force families into smaller apartments will likely suppress fertility rates, particularly for second and third children. And we need those second and third children to get the fertility rate above 2.1 to maintain the population. HSBC notes that for every 10% increase in house prices leads to a 1.3% drop in birth rate and an even sharper fall amongst renters. House prices are going up by over 7% per annum, which means birth rates will continue to drop by almost 1% per year. Nobody wants to talk about this, but it is an uncomfortable truth. So we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to deal with a fertility crisis through mass importation of Uber drivers from developing countries rather than providing an environment that encourages Australians to have babies? Australia is becoming the very case study of demographic replacement. The ABS data shows that in 2021, around 31% of the population was born overseas in New South Wales and Victoria. It's now 2024, but that was an aggregate, including young kids of migrants. When you look at 2021 data for cohorts like 30 to 40-year-olds, it's close to 42% of the population is foreign born. In 2024, it's likely that some age cohorts, for the majority of people in New South Wales and Victoria, are foreign born, or if not, they soon will be. For some strange reason, it looks like we're already there for the country as a whole for elderly males, possibly as a result of family reunification visas, and we see that at the very high end. No wonder the Australian Bureau of Statistics is dropping the proposal to add an ethnicity question to the upcoming 2026 census, despite similar questions being asked in the censuses of the UK, Canada and New Zealand. Australian government departments know to not ask a question when your masters don't want the answer to it. In the past year, 737,000 people arrived in the country, the majority from developing markets, providing the greatest change to Australian ethnicity and total population in our history, yet the ABS has decided to cease tracking the data that specifically tracks that in the census. The government will have no problem, however, in asking the last time you scratched your bum. For over 55s, where the proportion of foreign-born individuals is around 35%, the current idea being floated is that over 55s should be encouraged to sell their homes, move out and relocate to concentration camps, retirement homes, to make way for all these new people. Urban planners say that if the median house price to household income ratio is 3.0 to 4, is under 3.0, it's affordable. Between 3.1 and 4, it's moderately unaffordable. 4.1 to 5, it's seriously unaffordable, and 5.1 or over, severely unaffordable. I remember my parents telling me it was about 3 times their income to buy a house. In the latest Demographia International Housing Affordability Survey, Sydney is 13.8. Melbourne is 9.8. Last month, according to Dispatches, the median house price in Sydney was $1.820 million. That is the median across the whole city. With the median household income about $115,700, that makes Sydney closer to 16 times. If Sydney house prices dropped by 2/3, they would still be severely unaffordable. As a result, Australia ranks second in the world after Switzerland for household debt at 112% of GDP and 211% to disposable income. The housing crisis is so severe in Sydney, it now takes at least 46 years, and I'm saying now probably 50 years or more with the latest data, to save for the average house deposit, not house, deposit. With a median house price of $1.82 million, monthly mortgage repayments after a 20% deposit has been paid, God knows how, and a 6.87% comparison rate from the Commonwealth Bank, exceeds $9,194 after tax every month for 30 years, with total repayments exceeding $3.3 million, and about $1.85 million of that is interest paid to the Commonwealth Bank. Salaries are now useless to buy homes in Sydney. So how does anyone not think this is going to end in anything other than catastrophe? Even the Commonwealth Bank marvels at Australia's record high household debt to service ratio, a number that's extraordinary relative to other jurisdictions and rising more swiftly in Australia than any other region. I'll tell you what's also extraordinary. It's the Commonwealth Bank's market cap, which as of yesterday was bigger than Goldman Sachs and bigger than BHP by about 30 billion at 230 billion. And BHP is the biggest mining company in the world. In fact, does anything sound a little bit funny about a country with 0.33% of the world's population having a bank with a bigger market cap than the biggest Swiss bank, the biggest Japanese bank, the biggest Indian bank, the biggest French bank, the biggest German bank, the biggest Spanish bank, the biggest Russian bank, and the biggest Saudi Arabian bank? Anything funny about that? Especially when it has one product and one product only. After all, they lend bugger all to businesses. Has anyone tried getting a business loan? The one product they have is residential mortgages. We are talking about too big to fail on a scale like no other. And quite the flywheel has been created to get us here. The Big Four and Macquarie are 25% of the ASX 200, and every month, 11.5% of the Australian wage bill goes into superannuation, soon to be 12%. 8% of super is directly invested in property. 23% is invested in stocks, of which 25% are the Big Four banks and Macquarie. So relentlessly every month, 5.75% of super bids up the value of bank stocks. And that allows them to lend to more mortgages. And that's resulted in extreme market capitalisation for the Australian banks, and extreme on a scale like no other. If anyone thinks the RBA is coming to the rescue, should anything falter in the Australian banking system, they're dreaming. The RBA's problems of their own, being $14 billion in negative equity from loading up on federal and state government bonds during COVID, the value of which collapsed with rising interest rates. The absurdity of our housing market rivals that of Japan's infamous asset price bubble. At its peak, the grounds of Tokyo's Imperial Palace were estimated to be worth more than the entire real estate of California. Now, there's plenty of places you can buy for 30 or 40 grand. 2 weeks ago, this terrace house was listed near me in Wallara for $18 million. This is just a terrace. It's been renovated nicely. It's just a terrace. These things used to sell for 1 point something or other, or 800K, not so long ago. For $18 million, you can buy a 260-foot 2025 model cruise ship with 80 berths. Australia used to have an economy that made things, but instead turned into a Ponzi scheme dependent upon mass migration to fuel the housing market, drive consumption, and provide a workforce to service coffee. In between, to quote Jonathan Tepper, Australia is the only country we know of where middle-class houses are auctioned like paintings. 3 of our 4 top exports in 2023 were dead trees, being coal, dirt, being iron ore, and gas from dead trees, being natural gas. Of everything we dig up or make, 29% goes to China, an export dependency on par with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gambia, and the Central African Republic. We've managed to simultaneously piss off and utterly become dependent upon a country currently weathering a major real estate meltdown. In return, we take 2% of China's exports, and we've become quite the banana republic. Our third biggest export, and up with a bullet in 2023, according to the ABS, is the export of travel services, which are a staggering up 97.3% to $70.1 billion per annum. Did anyone know that? Of this, the biggest component of travel services is education-related travel services, a euphemism for immigration dressed up as education, which leapt 79.8% on the year to 47.8 billion. Travel now represents 61.8% of Australia's total services exports, of which education-related travel is 68.2%, making this paper-pushing Ponzi scheme of selling visas to students 42% of all services exports in this country. Only that $47.8 billion export is not really an export. As we all know, these students are not really students. Indeed, the export of education-related travel services is nothing more than a statistical trick, which the ABS calculates as simply the number of international students in the country, multiplied by the average spend estimate from Tourism Research Australia, added to total educational course fees as estimated by the Department of Education. Normally, ABS methodology determines the centre of predominant economic interest to determine whether a person is a tourist buying an export service or a local resident engaged in normal economic activity. Only with international students, the ABS cooks the books. Quoting the ABS verbatim, the only exception to the residency guideline is for international students who are deemed residents of their home economies for the duration of their study. So yes, we apparently export rent. And if an international student buys a paddle pop, it's an export. International students are supposed to show they're not a burden on society, requiring proof of $29,710 to afford to live in Australia. Even though I'm not sure how anyone's supposed to live on that. Another $13,502 is supposed to be set aside for educational expenses. And that sounds a little bit low. Surprisingly, the government only requires to provide proof you've had $29,710 and only once, regardless of how many years you'll be studying for and regardless of how much you really need to live. Study Australia reckons that if you want to live in a shared house in Sydney as a student, you only need to have $292 a week budgeted if you want to live in the city. Looking at the properties for that budget, you have a choice of a locker for your things and one of 6 bunk beds, or slumlord accommodation. Alternatively, you can pitch a tent in a share house living room, or if you want to be really special, for $360 a week, you can live in someone's balcony and share a toilet. Following outrage at the news reports on this listing, the government announced they're launching an investigation. The first thing the government should start investigating is the government. Last year, there were 786,891 international students in the country, and while the ABS considers every dollar they spend, including rent, as an export, in reality, most of this money is earned here as they prioritise work opportunities over educational quality. This is not an export, it's a backdoor immigration program. And indeed, in a recent survey of the most important factors influencing the choice of study destination from students from South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, quality of education was ranked last or second to last, while access to post-study work rights and opportunities to work while studying was first. YouTube and TikTok are full of videos from international students explaining how to rort free food out of the Australian system. I'm not sure why we're providing visas for international students who can't afford to feed themselves. This is supposed to be an export, not a humanitarian program. And meanwhile, flooding fake students into the country and causing a cost of living crisis is resulting in Australian kids dropping out of school at an increasing rate, with Year 10 to 12 retention rates dropping 5.5% from 2017 to 2023, undoing 2 decades of improvement. Are we the lucky country or the dumb country? If education-related travel services really were a $48 billion export, surely we would at least see it in cash coming into the country each year. When you look at the international remittance volume into Australia, in 2023, there was only $2 billion coming in and $10 billion going out. You would think someone would sanity check basic numbers such as this. And I'll give you another number to sanity check. 12,665 of our students study abroad. In 1990, we took in 25,000 international students. Now we take in 786,981. This kind of sounds like a lot, particularly when, according to UNESCO, there are only 6.4 million international students in the entire world that go overseas to study. Does anyone wonder why we have a cost of living crisis when Australia has 12% of the entire global international student population crammed mostly into 2 or 3 cities? The university should be rolling in cash, given they're running a multi-billion-dollar human trafficking scheme, operating with full government cooperation. Yet bringing in 12% of the entire world's international student population still has every university in New South Wales, except the University of Sydney, losing money. Of course, half of the University of Sydney students are now foreign, which really calls into question why they should receive taxpayer funding and be exempt from income tax. It's actually worse than that. Australia is hosting at least 15% of the entire global international student population from low to middle income countries, or countries where the gross national income is between $1,000 and $4,500 per capita. This is when Australia's total population is only 0.33% of the world's. The number of students in Australia is totally out of control, and most people know they're not students. These students are not the best and brightest from the likes of the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, where 1.2 million students are competing for 10,000 places. No, the 786,891 students we get are not even the applicants that failed to get into IIT. They're economic migrants. Education in India, like Australia, is now a big business, and wherever money goes, so does fraud. In a recent Bloomberg article entitled "Worthless Degrees Are Creating an Unemployable Generation in India," and they're certainly going to create an unemployable generation in Australia, a former Indian Secretary for School Education said of the 16,000 colleges handing out bachelor's qualifications for teachers, a large number only exist in name. A former Dean of Delhi University said calling such so-called degrees as being worthless would be by far an understatement. If those 786,891 students were really students, where are our Nobel Prizes? Where's the mountains of technological and scientific research to be spewing out of universities? Where are all the undergraduates from Stanford, IIT or Cambridge that should be doing graduate study in Australia's top universities? But for the better part of the last decade, even though international student numbers have gone tilt, the number of students enrolled in doctorates have been declining. In the last report from Nature, India has now overtaken us for research output, with our score dropping by 14% despite this record numbers. Australian Research Council discovery funding, project funding, has halved in 20 years. And Kylie Walker, the Chief Executive of the Australian Academy of Technological Science and Engineering, says that's just one more sign of a scientific slowdown in a country facing many challenges. What sort of education is Australia actually providing to these students? Well, if you thought $13,502 the Department of Education requires international students for education sounded a bit funny, before May, they only needed $9,661. Doesn't that sound a bit low when the University of Sydney charges over $50,000 for a degree and the average Australian student accrues a HECS debt of over $26,000 over their study? I'll tell you what else sounds a bit funny. Last year, we got the most students from China. Okay, that makes sense. It's a big country. And India, number 2. Okay, that makes sense. Third is Nepal, a country less known for its academic output, but well known for powering our kitchens and nursing homes. But fourth is Colombia, where no satisfactory explanation exists for a country at least 30 hours away and 3 or 4 flights by plane, is the 4th largest country for international students coming into Australia. I mean, in completely unrelated news, 253 kilograms of cocaine washed up on New South Wales beaches in a single month in January. And just a month before, $1 billion of the stuff was found in an apartment in Ryde. And Four Corners says cartels are bringing in by the ton. But Colombia higher than, say, Indonesia? Mass immigration and asylum policies in Western Europe countries have led to a notable and significant cultural changes. These changes have been met by a range of criticisms, and as with Australia, the proponents of these policies argue that any perceived disadvantage is associated by the offset for positive economic impacts. It is, however, an uncomfortable truth that not all countries' immigrants are equal in terms of net financial contribution to their new country, and that's where the net financial contribution of a person is simply the total contribution to state finances minus the total cost to host them. The Danish government analysed this in a public finances study in 2018, and it comes no surprise that the children and the elderly tend to be net beneficiaries of public resources, as they tend to require more support in the form of education, healthcare, and social services. But to balance this, it's imperative that individuals in their peak earning years make a significant positive net contribution to the system. And the report just simply found that immigrants from some countries never produced a net positive financial contribution to public finances, presumably because of differences in wealth, education, skills, and values. And there are researchers who question whether immigration in aggregate at all has ever resulted in a positive impact. In short, they argue that open borders and a welfare state is a recipe for disaster. And you can see there's a lot of problems in Europe as a result of these policies. The other question is, where are the students from Western or high-income countries in Australia? There's a trickle from Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, but the Americans are gone. Between 2002 to 2021, we had a total of 158,000 American students coming in and studying in Australia. In 2022, we had 2,000. They're gone. It seems we have devalued the Australian educational system. Cheating is up over 1,000% at the University of Sydney, and this has been going on for decades. I mean, I used to teach there as an adjunct professor, associate professor, and I would have students, even back then, hand in booklets in the exam that were completely blank. It was clear that they'd forged their academic qualifications back at home, and the pressure from the university to pass these students was intense because that's how the universities get remunerated. Instead of the American students that we used to get, we have a mass student immigration from Colombia, where the GDP per capita is $7,000. Our second biggest country is India, where the GDP per capita is less than half of that, at 2,730. Third is Nepal, where the GDP per capita is less than half, again at 1,400. And what sort of education can these students afford from these countries? The sort you find crammed in a dozen at a time in a C-grade office in a tower between immigration lawyers and migration agents. Of the 787,000 international students, 272,000 of these are enrolled in vocational programs or VET courses, 79,078 to study English. The top areas of study are management and commerce courses, not at universities, but at VET programs, where the educational content is lower than the back of a Kellogg's cornflake packet. Courses on how to interview for a job and making sure that employees aren't overworked. We're bringing in 15% of the world's international students from poor countries, and they're here to study this. What exactly does anyone think this pantomime of education leads to? What outcomes would anyone reasonably expect to achieve from an advanced diploma of leadership and talent from one of a dozen business colleges crammed into a random building in Pitt Street? Does anyone expect that this qualification will lead to better opportunities when the student returns back to Colombia, Nepal, India, or China? Why are we flooding the country with hundreds of thousands of students studying junk courses in English when Australians are choosing between heating and eating? Why are we entertaining this when 300 colleges were put on notice amid a government crackdown on vocational providers offering international students visas but no education? Someone made a joke that, Uber has no cars, Airbnb has no hotels, the Australian educational system has no education. When in some local government areas, international students consume up to 24% of the local rental market, where in the Melbourne LGA, they consume 21.8% of the rental properties, in Sydney, 14.6% of the rental properties, when the national vacancy rate is 1%, where potentially 4 out of 5 new homes were consumed by these students by 2028, when 77% of renters and 49% of mortgage holders are in financial stress as of July, with outgoings greater than incomings, according to DFA analytics, where 83% of renters in New South Wales and 74% of renters in Queensland are in rental stress, also according to DFA, where skilled migrants are also in stress. In fact, they're the biggest demographic. At 85% are going immediately into rental stress as soon as they get here. And also where the skilled migrant program is no better, where the skilled migrant program is not actually a skilled migrant program, with less than 1/3 of permanent migrants to Australia being selected even partly for their skills. Where the largest category of permanent residents coming in by far are partners of immigrants into the skilled stream and partners into the family stream, over 100,000 per annum, where there's no skills testing whatsoever. There is actually one skilled category in the Australian migration program where candidates are targeted for quality and skills, and it is very good. It's called the Global Talent Program, a migration pathway for individuals with outstanding achievements, particularly high-earning individuals in future-focused sectors such as AI, computer science, hydrogen technology, engineering, and so forth. And I've actually had someone join my company through that program. But last year we allowed a total of 5,000 people in that program, and next year it's been cut to 4,000. What on earth is going on with Australia's migration program? Instead, our skilled migration program targets illustrious categories such as amusement centre manager, antique dealer, betting agency manager, dog or horse racing official, hairdresser, librarian, florist, recreation officer, makeup artist, and believe it or not, migration agent. We're bringing in migrant migration agents to help run our migration program. What could possibly go wrong? Maybe a migration program that's totally out of control, clogged with appeals? You really can't make this stuff up. Are these really critical skills that we must import, or are we potentially importing future welfare participants? I mean, let's just look at yoga instructors. There are only 2,000 yoga instructors listed on Yoga Australia's website. But we recently signed a free trade agreement with India that guarantees visas for another 1,800 per year of culturally significant occupations, which specifically calls out yoga instructors and chefs, in a special category, a visa which lasts for 4 years and allows extensions. I would expect we're also bringing in yoga instructors from other countries, other than India. In June of 2024, Jobs and Skills Australia released a draft list of jobs that we prioritised for fast track. On the confident on list for critical skills to import are, yes, you guessed it, yoga instructors. On the confident off list are manufacturers, farmers, and microbiologists. Who is in charge here and what the hell is going on? The whole immigration program is a circus. Brickworks, the largest brick manufacturer in Australia, is demanding we bring in more migrants as bricklayers to build more houses for migrants. However, the CFMEU says there is no tradie shortage in Australia. None. And to quote them, "It is bullshit that is designed to hurt Australian workers," Mr. Smith said. "We exposed the blatant lie that Australia is suffering from a tradie shortage that must be fixed through migration." Now, I know the CFMEU has been going to put into administration, but according to their research, for most construction-related professions, the vacancy rate is below 1%. They said in February, despite a national workforce of 27,600 plasterers, there are only 56 job ads listed. And with 300,000 bricklayers and stonemasons employed, only 111 jobs were posted, a vacancy rate of 0.4%. Well, I took a look at Seek myself, and you can do it yourself. There were 25 positions posted for bricklayers on Seek. There were 151 on Gumtree. There were 16 on Indeed. I expect there's a bunch more on Facebook and other locations, but it doesn't seem like we need tens of thousands. I never thought I would say it, but it seems the CFMEU is actually correct. Job creation in Australia is a mirage. With 2.4 million people in this country on temporary visas and over 100,000 new permanent and long-term arrivals arriving monthly, for example, in February, we're not creating jobs, we're creating a crisis. Where are they living? What jobs are we creating for them? Construction, touted as needing more workers, has only increased employment by 0.3% in 18 months, with 4,677 jobs. It is also the #1 sector for insolvencies, a record high. Builders can't build homes at prices people can afford to pay. So where are the jobs being created in Australia? And this is absolutely mind-blowing. It is almost entirely the NDIS economy. This completely out of control freight train of a program is only a decade old, spending $42 billion a year, more than aged care, Medicare, hospital funding. It's growing at 20% annually. It's set to cost over $100 billion by 2034. With 650,000 recipients, it's costing an average of $64,000 per person, with reports of misuse and questionable eligibility, which some are spending on sex toys, and tarot card readers. And even Bill Shorten, who runs the NDIS, said people are spending on cryptocurrency or steam rooms, or in one case, people organising 20 people to go to Japan. Somehow, 12% of boys aged between 5 and 7 in this country are on NDIS. But NDIS is not the only disability program that Australia forks money hand over fist on. In total, we're spending $84 billion a year, or 3% of GDP, across NDIS, disability support pension and carer payments, double the UK, double Canada. And it's the NDIS, together with the immigration Ponzi and government jobs, to oversee the whole mess, are the only things that are creating jobs in this country. And I actually mean the only things that are creating jobs in this country. Fellow Australians, behold the NDIS. Tinder sucks, so let's use the NDIS to pay for sex. Only 165,000 jobs were created outside of healthcare and social assistance in this entire country in the last 18 months. And 102,000 of those were to keep the Ponzi running. Education and bullshit educational providers, arts and recreational services added 58,511 yoga teachers and the like, although I suspect most of these jobs are primarily some form of rehabilitation for NDIS. Administration and support services, which provide travel agents, migration agents, and employment services for the Ponzi, added another 54,000 jobs, and public administration and safety added 52,000 jobs to run the government programs to make the Ponzi work, bring people in, and run the NDIS. Every industry outside of that added bugger all jobs. I'm from the technology industry. Can you imagine how many jobs were created in the technology industry since December 2022? Wait for it. 177. Total. 177. We are bringing in 1.7 people per minute into the country, or 10,000 a week, and there are no jobs of them outside supporting the immigration Ponzi itself or NDIS. There is no job creation outside these industries. Finance is negative, manufacturing is negative. Even the government has had to concede that the garbage the NDIS is paying for isn't sustainable. The country is cactus. Outside the NDIS, job ads in Australia are down 20 to 30% in the last year. Chief Economist Tim Toohey from Yarra Capital reports that migrants are in fact taking Australians' jobs, as employment growth among non-migrant workers had dropped to essentially zero, and net migration is currently supplying 1.4 people for every job created. We're not importing skills, we're importing skills shortages as a result of the Ponzi itself. It's clear that immigration needs to be cut at least 90% until someone with a brain figures out what the hell is going on. And meanwhile, the country is falling apart at the seams. 70% of private hospitals are loss-making. Over 420 medicines are listed in shortage by the TGA. Australia has a short supply of saline and can't even make it. It's salt and water. The federal government is bringing in these people, but it's the state governments who have to pay for the roads, the transport, the education, the healthcare, and the police to cater for all these people. And the state governments are now bankrupt as a result of doing so. Australia's largest employer is the New South Wales government, surprise, surprise, which employs about 10% of people in the state and is cutting departments by up to 60%. They've just said work from home is over and everyone's back in the office. And in my experience, you churn 20 to 30% of your staff when doing so. That's probably a good thing. In Victoria, 2 of the largest health service providers have implemented an immediate hiring freeze. No new capital works programs, a ban on travel unless paid by external sources, and a reduction in elective surgery. The Victorian government also scrapped a promise to pay $40,000 for 40,000 more elective surgeries a year. Alfred Hospital has turned staff to turn the lights off to save money. 2 days ago, the ambulance chief resigned over an industrial dispute over excessive overtime as the ambulances were told hospitals were full and had to queue up in the car park. Just as nobody wants to join the army anymore, civic duty in this country has collapsed. With 42% of the population foreign and the rest are struggling to survive, it's no surprise. When's the last time you saw a Boy Scout? The number of firefighting volunteers has dropped 20% over a decade. Voluntary work is down 24% since 2016. Victorian government debt will balloon to $187.8 billion by 2027-2028, which will represent 25% of the value of all goods and services produced in the state in a year. They plan to turn this around by lifting taxes by 39% from 2022 to 2027. Victoria doesn't plan on cutting any spending. If you think the cost of living is going up, well, the cost of dying in Victoria is also going up by 650% to enact a will. Brisbane now ranks 12th out of 900 cities for the worst traffic in the world, ahead of Bangkok in the 2023 INRIC's Global Traffic Scorecard, with drivers living on average 3 days of their life each year sitting in traffic in the city. The flood of so-called skilled migrants, including yoga instructors and dog groomers, who aren't required to bring in any funds, combined with the influx of international students, each needing to demonstrate a paltry 29,710 in financial capacity, which I've been told the migration agents will provide to you to get in, and then you have to get back to the migration agent, less a fee once you're here. Just once, a sum supposedly to cover rent, food and educational expenses, places an immense burden on state governments responsible for providing essential infrastructure and services. The combined contribution of these groups provides a paltry sum that is woefully insufficient to cover the true costs associated with accommodating the huge growth in population, leaving state coffers to bear the brunt of the burden. It is an insult to the hard-working taxpayers of each state who are effectively shouldering the burden for the lifestyles of students and many economic migrants while their own quality of life crumbles. To give a feeling of true cost, where is it? Got it right here. The Australian government spends about $640 billion annually across defence, education, health, social security and welfare, housing and other public services. With a population of 26 million, that means that we each pay about $24,000 a year per capita for infrastructure. How is a student bringing in $29,000 to live on paying for their share of the infrastructure if it costs us $24,000? The current arrangement is a perverse inversion of what a rational, equitable system would look like. Instead of hard-working taxpayers of each state subsidising the lifestyles of students and economic migrants, shouldn't it be the other way around? Wouldn't a far more sensible approach be to levy a substantial infrastructure fee on these groups, commensurate with the true costs they impose upon our society? I mean, maybe a figure of, say, $50,000, so it's subsidised the other way around, per annum per student or unskilled family reunification visa recipient, will be a good starting point for infrastructure fee, a sum that reflects the immense value of the services provided by the great nation. Moreover, an infrastructure fee of this magnitude would act as a much-needed reality check. It would separate the genuine students and skilled migrants who are prepared to invest in their future and contribute to a society from those that see Australia merely as a convenient backdoor to permanent residency. It would get rid of the sham visa factories that we are running from garbage third-tier educational providers. It would also ensure that only those that are truly committed to the country and have the means to support themselves are welcome to the fold. If a student is truly exceptional, we can provide fellowships and scholarships, but only for exceptional people and only for high-quality educational providers. Instead, Australians are supposed to live with the deterioration in quality of life and economic circumstances and the mathematical impossibility of an Australian being able to buy the average house, given the salary is now useless to buy a house in most regions, or many regions in Australia. The solution, according to the media, used to be to load yourself up on debt. Leverage your $254 a week income to a $12 million property portfolio. They proclaim with stories like garbage train driver reveals how he built a 13-home property portfolio worth $12 million while earning less than McDonald's workers. Now the economic tsunami facing this country is such that not even the bank of mum and dad can save you. Australia has plunged so deep into this economic Ponzi that we now find ourselves in the late stages of Weimar Republic-style perversions, where not only the currency is getting not hyperinflated, but on the way there, but moral decay, societal degradation running rampant, as the very fabric of the nation unravels in the face of financial ruin and desperation. To the left, the Herald Sun offers Generation Z OnlyFans stars buying up big in Australia's property market. To the right, the Sydney Morning Herald proposes, unable to crack into the housing market, I went looking for cocaine. And they reckon there's 650 kilos still floating around Alpha Grads, by the way. The moral fabric of Australian society is being destroyed. There is no way I could have bought a property on a normal income, Aussie mum reveals as she turns to OnlyFans to buy a home. And there are hundreds of these articles in the press. Which way, young Australian? to the great Australian dream, stripping on the internet or beachcombing for cocaine. It's mental. Hyperinflation is a loss in the value of currency of 50% of a month, and we're far from that now. But tales from the Weimar Germany reveal the absurdity of hyperinflation, with the factory workers being paid daily wages at 11 a.m. by bundles of cash from atop a truck so they could scramble to the shops to buy anything available before the money lost all value. Now, in Australia, people probably aren't aware of it, and a lot of people probably think they're geniuses because they've been investing in the Australian housing market. Well, it's been a phenomenal trade for the last 60 years, but let me give you a little bit of a dose of reality. SQM Research calculates the Australian house prices have gained in value by 7.1% every year on average for the last 10 years. And you know what? If you talk to the average real estate agent, they'll probably tell the same thing. It's been going for decades. 7% per year, every year. You guys have probably heard that before, right? Reliable, safe as houses, 7% a year. But before you pat yourself on the back, would you hazard a guess at what rate our currency is being devalued? As measured by gold, on average, for the last 15 years. 7.1%. Actually, today it's 7.4%. That is to say, the value of the Australian dollar is devalued by 7.4% on average every year for the last 15 years. Welcome to Project Zimbabwe, where everyone's a millionaire. Just not how you expected. Government policy has inflated the cost of everything because jamming the country full of people to suppress wage growth while driving up the price of everything else is a deliberate design feature of our economic architecture worth boasting about. House prices have gone up almost triple the rate of wages since 1998. Australia is a developing economy pretending to be a first world economy. We know how this ends, and we have been here before, although everyone's been long dead to remember it. In the 1850s, the discovery of gold near Ballarat sparked the greatest gold rush in the history. 500,000 economic migrants flooded into Australia seeking fortune, igniting an unprecedented property boom. Sydney land values shot by 80%, and Melbourne doubled. And it did that in 4 years. When the global economy soured, banks failed, and land companies went bankrupt, house prices halved. And the resulting depression was deeper and more prolonged in the 1890s than the Great Depression of the 1930s. If you bought a house in the peak in the 1890s, it took you 70 years to break even, 7-0. History, it seems, doesn't rhyme. It is repeating itself with frightening precision. And this time the stakes are substantially higher. Government is supposed to maintain social order and stability and provide things that benefit society as a whole, but will be underprovided by the private market alone, such as infrastructure, education, public health, defence and environmental protection. It's supposed to improve the quality of life for its citizens, and it's supposed to represent the will of the people. Rather than providing the essential public goods that benefit society as a whole, Australian government has created a mass migration disaster and thrown the problem of providing these goods onto state governments, which have been forced to go into extreme levels of debt in the struggle to provide basic infrastructure. It has allowed our educational system to be overrun by a sham immigration scheme, our public health to buckle under the strains of overcrowding, our defence forces to be hollowed out, and our environment to be ravaged to make room for all these new people. The current government is not just failing at its fundamental duties, it is actively undermining all of them. Instead of maintaining social order and stability, it has divided us into race versus race, gender versus gender, divided our national parks, and plunges into economic chaos. It's deliberately creating division. Quite a number of people have started to get upset that they don't feel like they're living in their country anymore. I mean, you've got to buy a ticket these days for a band or catch a plane, and you wonder, where the hell is Eora or Naarm? Every public event you go to, even if it's the opening of a supermarket, seems to have a welcome to country. Primary school students are being forced to chant, always will be Aboriginal country. Citizenship ceremonies are being cancelled in 81 council areas in Australia Day, while supermarkets celebrate Diwali and Eid, but not on National Day. Then rather than defending Australia Day, the government adds fuel to the fire and says, well, it's up to the councils. What the hell is going on? I mean, it's pretty strange when even the fact checkers have to admit that Welcome to Country was invented by the comedian Ernie Dingo in 1976. Making shit up like that is actually pretty Australian, actually, I have to say. Well, what if I told you that within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the government has a nudge unit, very appropriately named Beta. using sophisticated behavioural economics techniques to subtly shape citizens' thoughts and behaviours. Consider the recent trend of renaming Australian cities and restricting access to national parks. While presented as a gesture of reconciliation and conservation, these could be nudges designed to weaken Australians' connection to their homeland. What would the goal of that be, potentially? Well, hypothetically, to create a populace less likely to oppose mass migration as they no longer truly feel native to the land. Is that what's actually happening? Who knows? But it all seems pretty damn strange. This came out of nowhere, doesn't it? Beta's work includes trying to convince people that their energy bills aren't that high and nudging elderly people to get COVID vaccines, a project that started, oddly enough, in 2024. This level of sophisticated manipulation begs the question, why does the Prime Minister need his own beta nudge unit? And what else are they nudging us towards without our knowledge? Far from improving the quality of life for its citizens, the government's policies have sent the Australian middle class and working class into poverty, a downward spiral of astronomically unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, a cost of living crisis, and mounting despair. Perhaps most damningly of all, it has utterly failed to represent the will of the people, instead prioritising fudged short-term economic gains, the interests of big business, developers and foreign nationals over the long-term well-being and prosperity of its own citizens. Anglicare says that only 289 homes in the entire country are affordable for renters. Meanwhile, 1,580 residential properties are being sold to foreigners every 3 months, mostly to China, where citizens are actually prohibited from sending more than $50,000 a year overseas and always have been, and where it's also been illegal for them to own property outside of China. In theory, foreigners are only allowed to buy new homes in this country, but the well-known trick in the real estate industry is to just make demolition of the existing home a condition of sale. After all, Transparency International rates Australia the worst money laundering property market in the world, giving examples of property money laundering by Sudanese generals, Chinese high rollers and Malaysian bankers. Australia is one of only 5 countries that doesn't require real estate agents to report suspicious transactions. The Australian Crime Commission estimates the total value of the Australian drug market at $12.4 billion, all of which needs to be laundered. Last year, when the AFP confiscated assets, 65% were real estate. Only now, with much opposition from the real estate industry, is consideration being given to looking into the problem. They've really managed to stuff it up for young Australians. If they want to rent, they're competing with the world's poorest, who are coming in sleeping in bunk beds, on balconies or in tents. If they want to buy a house, they're stuck on a never-ending treadmill trying to save for a deposit, competing with both the world's wealthy and hot money flowing in from all over the place. The consequences of this reckless policy extends far beyond the physical landscape. We're witnessing the erosion of Australia's social fabric, transforming us from a high-trust society to a low-trust one. Earlier this year, I went skiing in Japan. And the most amazing thing was the biggest news story was a school principal who was caught at the 7-Eleven. He had bought a cup of coffee. And when he poured his cup of coffee, he had hit the regular button, but he had actually poured himself, he'd paid for a regular, but he actually bought a large. A difference of 72 cents. The 59-year-old high school principal was caught all over the media. Every year went, there was the #1 story. He lost his job and lost his $200,000 pension. Such is the value placed on honesty and integrity in a high-trust society. Meanwhile, in Australia, people are being stabbed on a weekly basis, sometimes murdered by people unbeknownst to them at shopping centres, the university, the church, the bus stop, and while fishing. A decade ago, it would have been unheard of to have terrorism warning signs about armed offenders in the shopping centre, yet here we are. It seems that in Project Zimbabwe, the only thing going well is the machete market. The deterioration of social trust is a direct result of a rapid, reckless demographic change. We're sacrificing the very qualities that once made Australia a great place to live, trading for our high-trust society for a low-trust one. And for what? This is not just a failure of governance, it's a failure of the sacred trust between a nation and its leaders, a path that is politically untenable, morally wrong, and a national disgrace. I wrote the essay, Put Another Aussie on the Barbie, in order so I could personally understand what the hell is going on. I'd expect the path we're on was Hamlin's razor. Never attribute malice to something which is adequately explained by stupidity. That would correct itself quickly when some adults stepped into the room, but no adults have arrived. But the more you look at it, the more you realise perhaps something more sinister is going on. The first thing Albo did coming out of power was to push the voice. Why did Albo spend $500 million of taxpayers' money without bipartisan support when prior to this only 8 out of 44 referendums have ever got up? all of them with support from both parties. The Voice would constitutionally enshrine an unelected body to participate in government decision-making matters, meaning successive governments can't overturn it. It would have the right to make representations on any legislation, which Parliament would have to consider seriously. At worst, it could have been a third chamber of government, but more likely, at best, it would have been a body dominated, if not totally controlled by the ALP, to permanently frustrate all future legislation. That could explain why Albo punted $450 million of taxpayer money, even though the odds were low. The second thing Albanese done is ramp immigration. Prior to being elected, Albanese said that 160,000 new migrants was too many a year. He said, I quote, "I also know immigration shouldn't be a substitute for training Australian workers for Australian jobs." He also added, "We should not be a country where Australian workers are cut off from job opportunities." Yet with no mandate from the Australian people, Albo hiked new migrant arrivals to 737,000. In fact, the second he got elected, he went full Burchell on immigration, increasing permanent migration to 195,000, abolishing the skills list, guaranteeing 2.1 million temporary migrants a path to citizenship, halving withholding tax on foreign developers, mulling rent caps, and allowing New Zealanders citizenship. I mean, what's next? Tasmanians? Just kidding. I mean, if you're going to be pissed off about 1,300 people coming to Australia in the first fleet and 160,000 convicts coming over 80 years, surely you'd be more pissed off about 980,000 coming in the last two. If there's anything we need a referendum on, it's a voice on immigration levels. And if there's anything the Aborigines should be pissed off about, it's recent immigration policy. Some argue that the insane immigration push is designed to prop up the headline GDP figures, creating a facade of economic health despite GDP per capita declining the worst in 40 years. But given the damage and lack of economic viability from mass migration from poor countries, with the economic environment in Australia, social, cultural way of life deteriorating so quickly, this explanation alone seems insufficient. A more cynical interpretation is the government is engaged in a calculated effort to reshape the electorate through mass immigration. By bringing in people from countries with significantly lower per capita GDPs, they're potentially creating future left-leaning voters, tipping the scales in favour of the ALP on a two-party preferred basis once they become citizens. The Labor primary vote has been a one-way trip down for decades. It could possibly be their last-ditch effort to find voters is to import them. Under this theory, all Australians are suffering at the destruction of the Australian way of life and worst loss in wealth since the Great Depression, so one political party can hold grip onto power. Meanwhile, these poor economic migrants face out-of-control costs, chronic underemployment, outside of wiping bums in an aged care home, a housing market so expensive that 85% of migrants immediately fall into rental stress, the highest demographic of any in the country. By process of elimination, we arrive at the only plausible excuse left, which is exactly what many allege Biden and Trudeau are doing, importing future voters. In fact, so close are Albanese policies to Trudeau that Canadians are getting confused about which country I'm tweeting about on X. Like, honestly, you go there and people are confused, like literally, is it Canada? Well, Canadians will chip in, and it's crazy. Even the Greens have shifted from an environmental party to effectively a Middle Eastern immigration party. 15 years ago, they wanted immigration cut for a sustainable environment. Today, their path to power relies on increasing mass migration and turning these immigrants into a political force. When's the last time the Greens pushed an environmental policy? Can you remember? The Greens clearly see political advantage in exploiting marginalised ethnic conflicts overseas for their own advantage, thereby importing these conflicts to Australia. It's working for them, and the Muslim Times recently called for all Muslims to vote for the Greens. This has resulted in the two of the Greens' core voting blocs, the LGBTQ community and the religious Muslim groups, fighting with each other in the streets over issues like books and libraries, like literally fighting each other outside of council. 15 years ago, the Greens wanted immigration cut for a sustainable environment, and it's clear that their pathway to power now relies upon increasing to collectivise those immigrants into a political force. Lack of opposition to this has resulted in Australia having the 5th highest land clearing rate in the world, to support the 2nd highest home building program for major countries in the OECD. We're destroying our environment to house imported voters. If that's not a perversion of democracy, I don't know what is. The ALP ramping mass untargeted immigration for the gain of future voters is no more apparent than the current controversy over bringing in the refugees from Gaza. The strategy to pursue mass immigration to tip the two-party preferred vote to Labor has backfired spectacularly. As we've seen overseas, some immigrant communities prioritise their ancestral homeland's interests over domestic concerns. When these groups feel the mainstream parties aren't adequately addressing their specific needs or international priorities, they often splinter off to form their own ethnically or religiously aligned political parties. And in the classic case of blowback, a teal-style Muslim vote movement is taking shape, explicitly targeting federal Labor seats, targeting the seats of high-profile ministers like Jason Clare in Blaxland, Tony Burke in Watson, Chris Bowen in McMahon, which also boast the largest Muslim constituents in the country. Burke is now in charge of Home Affairs, and so what are they doing? There's 193 members of the UN, only a small number of countries they've taken in Gaza refugees. The UK took in 168, US 17, Canada 41, although these numbers are mostly for asylum, which we have not done. Instead, we granted 2,922 tourist visas, which will become permanent visas. Why? It's pretty obvious. This is purely for votes to fend off rising challenges in safe Labor seats. Now it turns out that there's been no manual screening of any of these people, and 43 have since had them revoked and 20 of them regained. You'd also have to wonder, given they're coming from a Hamas-controlled war zone, who would have the political or financial connections to get out? There's no limit to the risk of the damage this government will do to the country to secure power. And it also makes you wonder why Alba removed ASIO from the National Security Committee back in March, so whether it was potentially to bring in the 3,000 Palestinians on tourist visas. And also, there seems to be a bit of a spat between the security services and the government, because obviously they've just raised the national terrorism threat level to probable at the same time as all of this was going on. So pouring kerosene on identity politics and demographic change ignites a firestorm, immolating everyday Australians' dreams. This self-inflicted disaster engulfs both politics and the economy. The current system of granting permanent residency is a tinderbox of political exploitation. Albanese's actions have laid bare the dangers of allowing such critical decisions to be made within a single election cycle. Permanent residency should be carefully considered and more like Switzerland, being you have to be highly qualified and well integrated. It takes 5 to 10 years with a track record of good behaviour. It should not be a tool for short-term political gain by pyromaniacs. Only a leader completely out of their depth, in desperation, tries to silence dissent through laws when the consequences of his actions come home to roost. That's the third thing that Albanese has done. 20 years ago, Australia as a top social media censor was unthinkable. Now, under the pretense of protecting children, the government pushes an Orwellian ID scheme. This is not about safety, it's about control, tracking every voice ready to silence any dissent. Because in order to protect the children, you'll need to upload your driver's license to use social media. Instead of focusing on the things that matter, the government's actions seem to be singularly focused on consolidating power, regardless of the cost to the democratic foundations of the nation, the integrity of our legislation, the sanctity of our vote, and the freedom of our speech. Make no mistake, this is a war against Australians executed by Australia's political parties. In this war, existing Australians lose everything: their culture, economic security, housing affordability, and democratic say in their own affairs. And let's be clear, nobody agreed on this level of mass immigration, which is running at 1.7 per minute into this country. There is no possible way we can be building a house every 90 seconds to cope, nor should we be when there's no net new demand for housing whatsoever from Australians. There's been no real debate on its implications, no genuine discussion about the long-term effects on our society and our economy, no clear economic benefit from importing unskilled economic migrants and masses of students studying pantomime qualifications. Our GDP per capita is rapidly declining, with Australians facing the greatest decline in wealth since the Great Depression. And the stark reality is that when our economy is flatlined, the universities are hemorrhaging money, the state governments are also drowning in debt. Our culture is being eroded, the quality of life has collapsed for many Australians, yet the government claims they don't control immigration levels, nor do they model its impacts. This is either gross incompetence or deliberate deception, neither of which is acceptable. And the politicians are sleepwalking this country into ruin. Australians should be the wealthiest people in the world, and we used to be. In the 1880s, Melbourne was the richest city in the world. And you'd think that a country sitting on 1,200 years of coal supply, hoarding 28% of the world's uranium, and dominating the global LNG market as the second largest exporter with a 20% share, would have the cheapest and most reliable electricity in the world. You would also think that a country with a population density of 3.46 people per square kilometre would have cheap housing. You'd also think that a country with an iron grip on 56% of the global iron ore trade, the very backbone of modern industry, that Australia would be a colossus on the world stage, a nation whose might is forged in steel of its own making from iron ore, coal, and cheap power. You'd think a country that produces 47% of the world's lithium, the white gold of the 21st century, and the third largest producer of cobalt, fifth largest producer of nickel, sixth largest producer of copper, would be a titan of electrical and mechanical engineering. You would expect, with a river of gold flowing for its mines as the second largest gold producer in the world, that Australia would be a land of immense prosperity. All of this potential, with the dumb luck of commodities boom from a Chinese industrialization, a war of the energy powers of Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, and supply shortages. And just imagine the wealth Australia would have if we manufactured these raw commodities into higher value-add products. We have the raw materials in this country to make just about anything. Due to the catastrophe created by the cost of living crisis, we have the highest casual wages in the world at $24.10 an hour, although that's still not high enough to be able to live anywhere near where anyone works. So if Australia is to have a manufacturing industry, we better produce sophisticated value-added products. Yet after Uganda and Armenia, we rank 93rd in the Harvard Economic Complexity Index, a measure of how many different products a country can produce and how many countries are able to make those products. Indeed, manufacturing as a share of our gross value add is 5.39%, under a third of the world's average, on par with Equatorial Guinea, an economy so underdeveloped the country does not have a single cinema. For manufacturing, you need at minimum cheap energy and reliable energy. And our energy policy is a joke. We're an energy superpower with some of the world's highest energy costs. We ban nuclear power while build nuclear subs. We're told we can't have a gas cooktop because of the environment, but then we export our gas and coal to someone else to burn it, then cry poor about emissions while our citizens face shortages and sky-high prices. It's like Saudi Arabia denying its people cheap petrol. We're not saving the environment, we're just outsourcing our emissions and impoverishing our own people. BlueScope Steel says they're paying 3 times more for gas than in the US and double for electricity. And electricity prices have tripled since Albo came into power. The problem is there's no such thing as a low-energy country that is wealthy. That's an issue when Australia's manufacturing as a percentage of the economy is on par with Botswana, where you get to go see cheetahs. You'd never be able to bring back manufacturing in this country unless you have cheap, reliable energy, and for that you need to turn coal back on, start a gas reservation scheme, and ultimately build out nuclear. And without a powerful manufacturing industry, you'll never have a strong defence industry, and the country will be indefensible. So while the politicians are stuffing around trying to manipulate the control of legislative power, gerrymandering voting by importing future voters, and suppressing free speech, they're ignoring a much bigger problem the country faces. Australia, the resource titan, has an even bigger Achilles heel, gaping holes in its economic armour that could bring the entire nation to its knees in a few days. Without this resource, perishable goods such as fresh produce, dairy and meat would start running low in 1 to 2 days. Within 3 days, iron ore, coal and mineral extraction would grind to a halt. Public transport would be in crisis. Within 3 to 5 days, many frozen and refrigerated foods and popular non-perishable items would exhaust. By the end of the week, planting, harvesting and transportation of crops would cease and livestock management would become extremely difficult. Waste would become accumulating in urban areas and building projects across the country would stop. In 1 to 2 weeks, the majority of supermarket shelves would be empty and any remaining stock would be rationed. And as Doomberg wrote in No Worries, Mate, what is the Achilles heel of one of the world's most important economies? Australia has practically no capacity to refine oil and relies on imports to meet the vast majority of its demand for diesel, the fuel that makes its entire supply chain work. We import 90% of our liquid fuel through 2 operational oil refineries, which only survive through federal government support and hold 49 days of stock on shore, well below the 90-day minimum requirement. We have 21 days of diesel today and 27 days of petrol. Australia runs on the smell of an oily rag. And do you know what else we don't have? Merchant ships to bring in cargo. 30 years ago, we had 100 Australian flagged ships, all controlled by us. In 2021, we had 13. Before Labor came in, we had 2, which they promised to grow. Now we have 0. Australia is so dependent on foreign shipping that obtaining critical supplies during a national emergency can't be guaranteed, said the former Chief of the Navy. While we're screwing around looking like morons, appointing a parliamentary secretary for men's behaviour, a world war could start and we would be surprised. It would take a 3-week sea blockade and Australia would stop. So finally, and I know you've been here for a while, may I suggest some solutions we urgently need to address. The country needs to get the cost of living down, bring back manufacturing, and get the birth rate of Australians up. To do that, we need to get the cost of housing down, the cost of energy down, and stop government waste and cut immigration. The immigration system is completely out of control and being used for political purposes, not the benefit of the Australian citizen. It needs to be cut at least 90% while the whole system is reviewed, and it is rotten to the core. Those that have rorted the migration system by running ghost colleges should be prosecuted. Those students who have similarly exploited them to get a visa without bona fide education should have their visas cancelled and be deported. Given the devastation that's been wrought on the everyday Australians by these policies, we need to have a serious conversation about remigration. Those who commit crimes while on visas, fail to turn up to university, or fail their courses in their entirety should have their visas cancelled. And I know the pressure, being a university lecturer, having to pass them. I literally had people getting 0 in the exam, 0 in assignments, and the university reached out to me and go, can you give them a terminating pass to progress them, because that's how we get remunerated. And so you let people stay with a degree who literally got 0 in assignments and 0 in exams. I personally saw it. I taught for 14 years in engineering, right? We should not be accommodating students on visas in this country studying English while Australians are living in tents. They can learn online or in a country where the citizens are not choosing between heating and eating. Accreditation and visa rights should be stripped from poor quality educational providers. At the same time, the voice Australians need is on the level of immigration and the quality of individuals we want to bring in. There should be a referendum on immigration. And just like Switzerland, citizenship and welfare should be significantly harder to get and require someone to be skilled, well integrated, civic service to society, and to pledge allegiance to the country. New citizens should be prepared to fight for the country if, heaven forbid, we go to war. A likelihood that is increasing over time. An infrastructure tax should be levied on those that are already here, who have a burden without contribution, including the unskilled, those on reunification visas, not paying tax, and students. For the small number of true students that academically are exceptional, we can grant scholarships. For energy, we need to dump net zero, which is not only a fairy tale, but even if it's not, whatever Australia does will be completely irrelevant. We need to restart coal, implement a gas reservation scheme, and unwind the state and federal laws that make nuclear illegal in this country. We should do whatever it takes to cut energy prices by 2/3 at least. Without this, we'll never have a strong manufacturing industry. Without this, we'll have a continued erosion of our way of life, while the politicians try to paper over the cracks by mass immigration from third world countries, while the only jobs available for the poor sods is coming in from the government, pissing Australian wealth against the wall on the NDIS or the Ponzi itself. And finally, we need to focus on Australians. Policies that lift the birth rate, lift education, lift the skills of Australians. Everything the government is doing is damaging the birth rate of Australians, which is probably the most important number we need to lift. And we should be free to debate these things without an American e-safety commissioner and the real estate classifieds we pass off for a media industry in this country, censoring our speech and attacking our online town squares. Without the government and corporate Australia making us feel ashamed to be Australian and not welcome in this country. So maybe it's time to stop putting Australians on the Barbie and start getting this utter mess that's been created in this country sorted. Thank you.